Everyone, myself and my co-authors are excited to share with you our paper entitled Profiles of Youth Citizenship, a cluster analysis of ethical factors, demographics, and problem-solving disposition. So we know that community problems are increasing in number and complexity, and that diverse teams are essential to meet the needs and create viable solutions for these communities. Youth are community resources, however, they're usually not utilized as so. They are often untapped sources of knowledge and cultural capital. However, research has found that when youth engage in community collaborative problem solving, that the relationship is mutually beneficial for both the youth and the community. So this paper utilized a relational developmental systems meta theory or RDS approach, which is really this idea of this reciprocal bidirectional or circular relationship that exists between an individual and their context. So it's this idea that every experience, every environment, every place that I've been impacts me, but I also impact all of those places because I was there as well. So our development is really an accumulation of all of our experiences rather than based on one or two different traits. So what it has us do is that it actually says that when you look or examine experiences, you should be looking at them from a holistic approach, which is why I utilize person-centered analysis within this to create profiles of youth citizenship, as opposed to looking at individual variables. On that RDS meta theory, the purpose here was to utilize a person-centered analysis to develop profiles of youth citizenship, which we'll see in forms of clusters, and then look and see whether or not there's statistical differences in active and engaged citizenship based on those clusters. And you can see the other objectives listed here. There's a lot of information about the research design in the paper, and I encourage you to go take a look at it. But essentially, we studied 4-H youth members, teens in long-term and short-term leadership programs, and there were several different instruments utilized: a demographic questionnaire, problem-solving disposition instrument, a report card on ethics of American youth, and an AEC or active and engaged citizenship scale. And then we took all of that information and did a person-centered cluster analysis, so a two-way step cluster analysis to look at how the demographic variables, problem-solving disposition, and ethical factors based on that report card came together to form clusters, and then used a one-way analysis to examine how those clusters differed on AEC scale. So essentially how these clusters are developed is that we utilize statistical analysis to take those variables, and there were 8 variables plugged in, and they try to do what's shown here above me on the screen. They try to pull together groups as close as possible and maximize the distance between those groups. Relatively quickly, but there were 5 distinct clusters. Cluster 1 was white females from honors and AP courses and long-term leadership programs with high ethical views and activity involvement. Skipping over to cluster 5, you'll notice that the primary difference is they were white males and that they had high problem-solving disposition as opposed to activity involvement. Cluster 2 is our youngest cluster from short-term programs. They had low ethical views. Cluster 3 was white individuals from long-term leadership programs with the lowest ethical views, problem-solving dispositions, and activity involvement. And then finally, cluster 4 was our mixture of races, genders, and AP courses with high ethical views. One-way ANOVA results, I highlighted those statistical differences. Cluster 1 was statistically different in total AEC than all of the other clusters. Important to note here, remember I said cluster 5 was males and cluster 1 was females, that they are virtually the same. The biggest difference that we see here is that oftentimes females are expected to contribute, and males, especially in youth, are seen as nuisance to their community. So there could be some sociocultural underlying pinnings that have kind of resulted in this, so it's something to examine a little bit further. For civic duty, the biggest differences here was actually that cluster 1 and cluster 4 were from long-term programs. So perhaps we could actually see that there were some differences from those short-term involvements. And then finally, when we look at civic skills, the biggest difference between clusters 1 and 5 and cluster 3 was that cluster 3 did not take honors and AP courses. So there's something to examine a little bit further there as well, and how honors and AP courses kind of play into this idea of civic skills. And then finally, we saw no statistical differences in neighborhood connection or participation, and that could be just based upon what 4-H is meant to kind of develop, is that actual contribution to the community or participation within those pieces over overall attitude and then connection to different individuals. Recommendations here, obviously we need to be looking at a more diverse population that includes non-4-H members in order to really examine the role of honors and AP courses, and then also to look a little bit further into the gender. But I think the big key takeaway here is the difference between variable and person-centered analysis. From the variable-centered analysis, which I also did, The idea of gender and honors making an impact did not come about. So it's important that we think about different types of analyses that help us see a bigger picture or a more holistic view of things.